I've read many books about Chapel Hill. I've read many books about the civil rights movement in Chapel Hill. And I know this is in some ways a basketball book, but I actually think this is the best book that I've read about the civil rights movement here in the town of Chapel Hill. So I want to just applaud you for that. And one of the things that I like about the book is all the myth busting that it does about Chapel Hill. Some of the Dean Smith stories are not as true as perhaps many of us like to think. So maybe we can talk about many of the different stories in this book. We could talk about this notion of whether Dean Smith and Charles Scott, whether we would consider them historical figures. As a historian, I suppose I'm interested in these questions. But I wanted to start with the way that you start the book. You start with a very interesting story about 5 Morehead scholars being on a basketball team at UNC. I was wondering if you could tell us that story and talk about how that sparked your interest in the book that you ended up writing.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. It's great to be there, and I already see some friends, Roger Werner, Annis Author. How you guys doing up there? Thank you for joining this. A lot of fun we're going to have tonight. It goes back to kind of the family history of Carolina basketball and the connectivity and the way these players and all students who went to Carolina seem to have great connectivity with others over the years. And there were 5 players on the freshman team in 1966. And they were Morehead scholars. There were 5 scholarship players, Charlie Scott, Jim Delaney, Eddie Fogler, Gray Whitehead, and Al Armour. And then there were 5 Morehead scholars, Bob Bodie, Harold Pollard. I can't remember all of them at this point, but they had a lot of reunions. And over the years, it would come up as to how did 5 Morehead scholars get on this one basketball team? And Eddie Fogler, who's been a good, very best friend of mine for years and years, was in on one of the discussions, and he said, well, call Chansky because maybe he can look it up and do a column on it, you know? So they called me, and I called Chuck Lovelace, who was the head of the Morehead Foundation at the time. And I said, Chuck, can you look up and see if there are any Carolina athletic team had more than 1 Morehead scholar on it at the same time? And he did some research, and he called me back, and he said, I got to tell you this, but I got to really have kind of an off-the-record conversation with you about this. And I said, fine. And he said, no, there's never been a Carolina athletic team that had more than 1 Morehead scholar from the same class on it. Never. There's been a couple that had 2 Morehead scholars, 1 freshman, 1 sophomore, 1 senior. And he said, why? And I told him the notion of this, that everybody, the Morehead scholars seem to all agree that Dean Smith had something to do with this, because that's kind of the way Dean Smith operated. He was a guy who was a tremendous planner. He played the odds on a lot of things. And he said to me, he said, look, if you write a story on this about the Morehead scholars being on the team together, credit Dean Smith all you want, but don't give any credit to the Morehead Foundation at all. And I said, why is that, Chuck? And I didn't put this in the book because he didn't want me to, but he said, because it would be wrong to do that and a tremendous embarrassment to the Morehead Foundation. And I asked him why. He said, because in my history, the Morehead Foundation was one of the slowest, latest organizations on campus to integrate. They gave me the statistics about how late it was in the game before the Morehead scholars, now it's the Morehead Kane scholars, had a black member. And so it would be embarrassing to us if we took any credit for that, because not only we do not deserve any credit for it, we probably deserve some criticism for it. And so in talking about the whole idea of 5 Morehead scholars, we talked about how this is something that Dean Smith had to have in his mind. And because the other 5 guys who were the walk-ons, it was a 15-player team, the 5 scholarship guys, the 5 Moreheads, and the 5 walk-ons. All of those guys turned out to be players who Dean Smith knew when they were in high school. He knew them, he recruited them. They weren't good enough to be offered a scholarship, but he got to know their families. He got to know who they played with, who they played against in high school. And Richie Gersten, who was another one of the walk-ons, and some of the others remembered the tryouts with Larry Brown that day. And they were really good players from all over the state of North Carolina trying out. But the sense was that Larry Brown, who was the coach, knew who the guys were going to be on the team, and that he had worked it out with Dean ahead of time. And it was guys who came from great families. They had played with or against integrated teams in the past. And the great odds player, Dean Smith, figured, well, I'm going to roll the dice here, and I have to create a situation that has the best opportunity for Charlie Scott to be successful. And that's what he did. And all the guys who played that day, they weren't surprised when they tried out. They weren't surprised that their name were on the list or weren't on the list, because it seemed to be preordained.
Well, it seems to fall right in line with everything I know about Dean Smith, about he didn't let anything go to chance, right? He tried to control every single situation. So this idea of playing the odds, as you put it, and creating this situation, I guess, in which he thought Charles Scott could best thrive. I mean, you said 1966, this is Charles Scott's first year at UNC, and he's obviously walking into a hornet's nest in some ways, being not the first Black player on the program, but who's going to be the first Black scholarship player. I was wondering if you could take us back and give us your impressions of what Chapel Hill was like. Beginning around 1960, you tell the story of Dr. King coming to Chapel Hill and really kind of igniting a fire under the Black community about activism and about pressing for their rights. And we here at Chapel Hill now, and certainly my students, I think they have this idea of Chapel Hill as being, well, it's the southern slice of heaven, it's this progressive college town, it's always been this way. But your book really busts some of those myths.
Yeah, it did have a liberal faction to it, which stemmed from the faculty, the Arts and Science School. There were a lot of liberals in town. The artists, the starving artists, lived in the bungalows and the mill houses in Carborough. Some of the other well-known artists lived on Franklin Street and so forth. But the town in general was an old Southern town. It was very similar to a lot of the other university Southern towns. And it was surprising that they had black and white water fountains. They didn't even have Black dressing rooms in the clothing stores, because a Black came in to buy a suit usually wasn't allowed to try it on. So they couldn't determine that it fit, and they couldn't go home and try it on and take it back because they wouldn't take it. So there was a lot of things like that were going on that people on campus didn't like, but the idea that the university administration was very conservative and very opposed to change made it a hard nut to crack. And Dean Smith, when he took the job, he went to Frank McGuire as an assistant coach, and he said, and Frank knew his background, that his father, Alfred Smith, had integrated high school basketball in Kansas to great peril to his job and his family, and that Dean Smith had that kind of in his DNA and his imprinting. And Dean asked Frank McGuire about it, and Frank told him two things. He said, one is, I tried to recruit Will Chamberlain out of Overbrook High School in Kansas, but he couldn't get in. He said, the other thing is, Dean, he said, I don't think that Chapel Hill's ready for a Black player. And Dean asked him why, and he said, well, in 1952, when I had the team at St. John's, my last team that went out, won the regional and lost to Kansas, when you were an assistant, a reserve guard on that team, we had a player at St. John's named Solly Walker. You remember, there's a Black player in St. John's, and Solly Walker, when he came down to Raleigh to play with St. John's in the regionals, they played Everett Case and NC State on one night and Kentucky and Adolph Rupp the other night. Solly Walker had to stay in a broom closet at the hotel in Raleigh. And McGuire was so totally pissed off about that. He told Dean, he said, that was one of the most embarrassing things that's ever happened to me in coaching. And I just don't want any of my players to be subject to that. Plus, he had the four Catholics and a Jew who were going to go 32 and 0 in 1957 anyway. So at that point, he had a great team. You know, Rosenbluth, Quigg, Kearns, Brennan, and Quigg. So you know, Dean knew what he was up against. And the first year that he was there as the head coach, there was a player at Greensboro Dudley High School, which was a black high school, but a college prep black high school. His name was Lou Hudson. And some of you people may remember the name Lou Hudson because he went on to be all Big Ten at Minnesota, all American and all NBA. And Lou Hudson had all the test scores, he had the rankings for school. He had everything that you need to get in. And he certainly had the baseline that Carolina wanted for the SAT scores, but they wouldn't let him in. And Dean was really toasted from that point on. And it was a young Dean Smith who half the time, half the school didn't want him to be the head coach anyway, because, you know, Chuck Erickson and the Rams Club wanted another big name to succeed McGuire. So Dean had no juice. But to understand how Dean Smith operated, he very shortly after that put a guy named Ben Renwick, who was a recent graduate, an African-American kid who was looking for a job in the administration. And he got Ben Renwick a job in the undergraduate admissions office. So he would have an ally there if that ever came up again. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the way he operated, because he knew the playing field and he knew what he had to do. Fortunately, he had Pastor Bob Seymour from the Binkley Baptist Church, who Dean was very careful. He was a careful crusader early on, because he was hired by the university to coach the basketball team and win games. And a lot of times Bob Seymour did his preaching for him on Sunday mornings at Binkley Baptist.
Well, it sounds like Dean Smith really knew how to play the long game, and I'm really enchanted by that idea of the 1957 team being four Catholics and a Jew and Wilt Chamberlain. That would have been quite a squad there.
Well, Rosenbluth probably, you know, Rosenbluth wouldn't have come if Carolina had Chamberlain in the program.
Yeah, I guess so. So when did this, your impression, when did this become, you know, I was about to call it a crusade for Dean Smith, but it doesn't seem to be the right word, because one of the stories that you debunk, one of the myths, is that story that Dean Smith was desegregating restaurant after restaurant, like the Pines in Chapel Hill, and you're saying it's much more complicated than that. You know, when did this become something that Dean Smith felt that he had to do?
I think he felt like he had to do it at the beginning, and when he thought he had Lou Hudson, I mean, he could have had an all ACC player for sure his first year there in 1961-62, but the school wouldn't let him in, and then he kept trying to find one. He had black coaches in segregated high schools in Eastern North Carolina, like Harvey Reid and people like that, telling them, find me an African-American kid who can get into school here. I want to take him. And he knew that the school, you know, because Dean hadn't won anything. You know, I mean, he had a losing record his first season. He had a 12-12 record his third season. And until he brought in, he inherited Billy Cunningham and Larry Brown. But until he brought in Bobby Lewis and Larry Miller, and then that team, and he started winning, like I said, he had no juice. But he did have people looking for all over the state. And he did have Willie Cooper, right, who was a walk-on, who was the first black athlete to play for Carolina, but not as a scholarship player. And he was ready to offer Willie a scholarship after his freshman year. But Willie was a good student, and he had messed up in economics. And he told Coach Smith, I can't stay with basketball because I've got to concentrate on my studies. So I think it was a long game, Matt, that he was playing. And then Charlie Scott came along, and the whole Charlie Scott story is really unbelievable, because Charlie was from East Harlem. He was a product of a divorced family. He went to live with his father, who was an alcoholic cab driver in the city. And Charlie was one of these guys that no one from his family had ever been to college before. But he was playing AAU ball, and he was doing well in junior high school at the time. And there was a woman named Mrs. Jarrett who saw how smart Charlie was, and she wanted him to take this standard high school aptitude test, which was given in those days, and I still think it is given to maybe more than 20,000 kids, and they had to make a certain score. And if they did, they were eligible to get a scholarship to these privatized high schools in New York. And Charlie took the test, and to show how smart he was one of the 800 kids the 800 highest scorers, and he got a scholarship to Peter Stuyvesant High School. And so Mrs. Jarrett said, look, Charlie, I don't know whether you want to go to college or not, but you're smart enough to go to college. Anybody who can score in the top 800 in this test can get into any college. And so Charlie tucked that away. But then he thought, well, what college am I going to go to? Who's going to pay for it? Came from a very poor family. But while he was growing as a student, he was also growing physically and growing on the basketball court. And he started playing for these, I don't know what they called them back then, but these days would be the AAU teams, the teams. And his team, he would go to play a couple of games, and certain players would be on that team. And then the next games, the players weren't. And there was a guy named Earl the Goat Menengold, who was a high school legend in New York. And he would ask, where did the Goat go? Where did Earl go? And the coaches said, he went to a prep school and down south somewhere to play for them and hopefully get a college scholarship. And that crystallized in Charlie's mind what he wanted to do. And Charlie was smart enough to find out who the headmaster and the basketball coach was. It turned out to be the same guy, Frank McDuffie. And he
Laurinburg.
Yeah, Laurinburg Institute. And he got his address, and he went into the records office at Stuyvesant and got a copy of his transcript from his 9th grade, wrote a letter to McDuffie with his transcript and said, I want to come. And he sweated it out that entire summer before McDuffie called him at the end of the summer. And he said, we got you, you're in, half the scholarship we'll pay for. Here are the agencies in New York City to go to get the rest of the money. And Charlie went, he got the rest of the money. He packed a little suitcase and got on a bus and he went to Laurinburg Institute. And it was an adventure for him. It was an exciting adventure because, like a lot of the other kids who you made their bones on the schoolyard and wanted to stay in the schoolyard, Charlie wanted more than that. And so and the reason why New York City is so important in this whole story is because Dean Smith had a mantra. He knew that there were Black players in the ACC before Charlie Scott, but his mantra was, my first Black player has got to be smart enough to get into Carolina and get through Carolina because of what happened with Lou Hudson, right? Couldn't be any doubt whether the kid could get in. Number 2, he wanted his first Black player to be a star, so he wouldn't be seen on campus as there's the token Black who sits at the end of the bench. When he walked across campus, he wanted the other students to say, there's the star of the basketball team. And the third thing Dean wanted was he had to be tough enough, because he knew what Charlie was going to have to put up with a little bit in Chapel Hill, but mostly at Columbia, Clemson, Virginia, places like that. And he knew Charlie coming from Laurinburg and New York City was going to be tough enough for that. And so Charlie checked all those boxes.
Well, it's interesting. We think of this New York to Chapel Hill pipeline, right? Frank McGuire's Underground Railroad, but this is a different version of that, where Charlie's going to Laurinburg.
Totally different. And Charlie, Bill Chamberlain came after him, but that's why I want the young people to read the book and understand it. Charlie hadn't come to Carolina. Walter Davis, Phil Ford, they might have eventually come, but the pipeline started where Carolina became America's team because it was a multiracial team.
Well, and then to what extent was Charlie Scott the perfect guy? I was just teaching my baseball history course, and we're talking about Jackie Robinson, and there's the way in which Jackie Robinson is the perfect individual for this desegregation experiment in Major League Baseball. Did Dean Smith pick? I think I know the answer is obviously yes, but I'm looking for some details here. To what extent was Charles Scott the right choice, for this political project? It's more than a basketball project. We're talking about changing the way that people in the state of North Carolina perhaps think about race.
Well, it could never be the perfect. Did Jackie Robinson, was he welcomed into the major leagues? He had a terrible experience with how the players from some from his own team, and then also players from other teams, and how he was treated by the opposing fans and the players in the opposite dugout yelling terrible things to him. And Charlie had some of that. So that's why he had to be tough enough, the third element of that. So he comes to Carolina. He's one of 55 Black students on a campus of 13,000.
And this is 10 years after desegregation.
Yeah, well, it was 10 years after the Brown versus Board of Education, school desegregation. It was 2 years after the Civil Rights Act passed. Right. But 55 Black kids on campus who turned out to be the core of the Black student movement, who Dean Smith watched that thing grow, and he knew that sooner or later that they were going to pull Charlie in to be a spokesman, and that they knew that Charlie wanted a basketball career and to be successful at Carolina, graduate and go to the NBA. But he also knew that Charlie was tremendously proud of his race, and that he was going to be caught between a rock and a hard place. And he was, and Charlie did go to some Black student movements meetings, but he never spoke out. He attended the famous meeting where the Black student movement went in with Chancellor Carlisle Citizen, and they presented Citizen with 23 demands. Right. Charlie was there in visual support, but didn't speak. And that was the way he skated it. So it wasn't perfect for him. And the one thing that he really understood was he couldn't go to Airing House with Larry Miller to hang out with the football team, which was all white at the time. He couldn't go to the Deke House with Rusty Clark to hang out the Deke House. And he couldn't go, anywhere that all the players went, because he wasn't welcome. He would make them uncomfortable, and he was uncomfortable. So he found his social life at North Carolina Central, where some of the Black kids on campus said that they would hang out. And Charlie found his way over there. And when I asked Charlie one time that, Dean found Central for you, right? And he said, oh, no, Dean didn't do that. I found that by myself. So he was proud of the fact that he found a way to survive. And then he met his wife, Margaret Holmes, who he met and married after his sophomore year. And Margaret, who's a wonderful lady, and I was the first person to really ever talk to the original Mrs. Charlie Scott in doing the book. She was the one who really helped him get through Carolina.
Well, your book really does we like to think that people come to Carolina and have the time of their lives, but your book really does portray a lonely student, right? Someone trying to fit in. And again, when Friday night came and the beer busts were happening on Frat Row, he was going over to the firm where he just felt like he fit in more. And I was
Charlie's boundaries with the white lines of the basketball court. That is where he was really comfortable. But outside of that, he had to make his own way. And I think Larry Brown, his first year, and then John Lotz especially, because John became like his second father, helped as much as he could. But Charlie was, the odds of Charlie making it through Carolina were not great.
Well, the basketball story, what he does at Carolina is well known. And there are two stories that you tell in your book that I find really intriguing. They both involve possible boycotts. And one of them is, I was talking to Larry Miller with this crowd a couple months ago, and we were talking about how he was not really eligible for the 1968 Olympic team because he had already graduated, and then he was off to the pros, to the ABA. But Charles Scott was obviously one of the better players in the United States at this time. The Black student movement had to be putting a lot of pressure on Charles Scott to boycott, right? To go along with Mike Warren and Lou Alcindor and some of the Black basketball players who weren't going to represent the United States in 1968. But Charles Scott ultimately went. What do you know about that decision of his?
Well, I know a lot about it. Coincidentally, Carolina played in the 1968 Final Four against UCLA, lost at the time, the game that we held the ball in the first half and ended up losing by the biggest margin up to the time where Duke had blown out by UNLV in 1990.
Larry Miller said they would have won that game had they run with UCLA.
Yeah, maybe, but maybe not. But Harvey Edwards was the guy who was behind the Olympic boycott at that time, and he was a former track coach and track star, and he was the guy who was getting Alcindor and all of those guys who did boycott the Olympics. And he went to Charlie when he met Charlie when Charlie was out in LA for that Final Four. And he said, the Olympics are coming up, and these guys are boycotting it and want you to boycott it too. And Charlie is amazing. I mean, he looked at him and he said, look, I went to Carolina to break the color barrier at Carolina. Okay. Why would I boycott the Olympics? That seems counterproductive to everything that I was trying to do at UNC. So he went, and John Lotz was an amazing, and we'll get to why this is, but he was an amazing influence on Charlie because he was his big brother, his second father. And he said, just go to the Olympic trials. You know, Hank Eibel loves defense, right? Just go and play your ass off on defense, score when you can, but show that you can play defense and you'll make that team. And that's what he did. And he was a star of the Olympic team. And, you know, that's a whole different, he was right there with Jones and Lee when they raised a black fist on the medal stand, and that Avery Brundage, the head of the Olympics, got all the other athletes after they threw those guys out of the Olympics. He got all the other athletes together and said, you do this, you're out, your medals are going to be stripped. You know, you towed the line from here on out. But he came back and with his gold medal, and he told some horrific stories about what went on, you know, that in those Olympics. So he went through a lot, and he survived a lot.
Well, it was a tough place to be for a black athlete in 1968, right? If you go to the Olympics, you're attacked perhaps from other African Americans for being a sellout to the cause. But if you boycott, you're attacked for not loving your country. And I'm struck with that, the way Charlie Scott thought of it in this sort of big picture terms, you know, as opposed to Lou Alcindor, who was not a symbol of desegregation at UCLA, that university and basketball program had been desegregated for decades. That is Charles Scott's sort of cultural meaning. And boycotting in 1968 perhaps would have worked against that. The story, though, that I just find so interesting is Charlie Scott, I'm not sure if the word is threatening or thinking about boycotting the NCAA East Regional in 1969 because of the ACC Player of the Year voting. And I'm just thinking, wow, what if this had happened? Can you walk us through that kind of really remarkable and sort of unprecedented story?
Well, it wasn't really the ACC Player of the Year that he eventually lost to John Roach, who was this white golden boy at South Carolina, ironically coached by Frank McGuire at the time. And John really won it on one game when he had 38 points in the upset of Carolina in Charlotte in the old North-South doubleheader in 1969. But when the all ACC voting came out that year, 5 voters left Charlie Scott off of the first team. Now, if you're the biggest South Carolina fan in the world, you're saying John Roach is the best player in the ACC, okay, but Charlie Scott's got to be second. There's no way in the world that Charlie Scott isn't among the 5 best players in the ACC. And all of the dean was mad, all of his teammates were mad, and he goes to Charlotte, and then he scores 28 against Duke in the second half after Grubar gets hurt early in the game, and I'm sitting there, I'm covering it for the Daily Tar Heel, and Charlie's screaming at the players, get out of the way, give me the ball. And he just goes one-on-one. He makes 12 out of 13 shots in the second half, scores 28 points. They come from behind. They beat Duke, and they move on to the regionals. And after the Sweet 16 game against Duquesne, this is up in College Park, Maryland, the Washington Press, which is all over the story, much more aggressive press than even that we have now in North Carolina, asked Charlie about the all ACC team, and Charlie spoke out and he said, look, this is the first time in my life I've ever had my race held against me in basketball. 5 guys didn't vote for me because I'm black. And story broke out, and then so now they're playing on Saturday morning, they're playing Davidson, the team that Lefty Driesell coached, and they beat in Raleigh the year before to go to the 1968 Final Four. And they're playing without Grubar, who was a very important player on that team. And Charlie decides that, and this is because what you said, Matt, now the Black student movement had already been banging on him, you know, make a statement. And Charlie thinks this is the opportunity to do that. And so he tells Coach Smith the night before the game that he's thinking about not playing in the game. So Dean Smith calls a meeting a team meeting on Saturday morning. The game was in the afternoon. I think it was about a 3 o'clock game. And he calls a team meeting in his hotel room. And everybody thinks it's really strange because Dean Smith did everything by the book, by the schedule. Practice here, meal here, this, that, and like. For him to call an impromptu meeting on that Saturday morning was strange. So everybody shows up in Dean Smith's hotel room, and everybody's there besides Charlie and John Lotz. And the players want to know where Charlie and John are. And Dean says Charlie's upset. He's with Coach Lotz, but he doesn't tell him what's going on. He just says that after the game against Davidson, win or lose, the media is going to ask you about, and I just want you to be prepared to think about it. I'm not telling you what to say. You say what you want, but the media is going to ask you about it. Meanwhile, John Lotz is riding around in Dean's rental car in College Park, Maryland with Charlie talking about this thing. And John Lotz says to him, Charlie, if you don't play in the game, who are you going to hurt? You're going to hurt the players who love you, your teammates, they love you and you love them. The voting's already over. I mean, who are you going to hurt? You're going to hurt your own teammates. My suggestion to you was go out on the court that day and prove those voters wrong. And he decided to play. So instead of being on the bus on the way to Cole Fieldhouse, John and Charlie end up in the rental car, and Charlie runs out on the court with the team. And if anybody is old enough to remember that game, 32 points, buzzer beater at the end of the game to send them to the Final Four. And Jim Delaney was the man who made the assist. Our fraternity brother, Roger Werner knows that, our fraternity brother from Teb, Jimbo, threw him the ball. And Charlie was supposed, Dean said, look for Rusty and Bunning underneath. And he knew when Charlie got the ball in his hand, he wasn't giving it up. He went to the foul line, skied high, and hit the buzzer beater that sent them to the Final Four. Now, Matt, that's a really interesting question that you ask, because I always ask people, how does that change history? Mm-hmm. What the legacy of Charlie Scott and Dean Smith would be if Charlie didn't play in that game. Now you have to remember, this is 1969, a very conservative university that didn't let Lou Hudson in 1962. They let Charlie in, but in their minds, we're letting this black boy, in quotes, here, give him a scholarship to play basketball here. And he doesn't play in the most important game of the 1969 season. My contention is Charlie Scott's legacy might have ended up the same way, but it would have started off a lot differently. A lot of people wouldn't have forgiven him for years and years and years. And my contention is that Dean Smith would have lost his job eventually, because he would have been called into his office coming back from College Park that day, and whoever it was, the board of trustees or whoever it was, would have said, Coach, explain to me, we gave this kid a scholarship to play basketball here, and he didn't play in the most important game of the year. Explain to me how that happened. And Dean could have said, well, the racial stuff and all that. And whatever answer you would have given him, they would have asked him the same question again. They said, okay, Dean, now tell me again why this kid that we gave a basketball scholarship to didn't play in the most important game of the year. I think Dean Smith doesn't keep his job in the long run. I mean, maybe he does for the next year because they just came off the third Final Four. But once Charlie was gone, once Clark and Gruber and Bunning and those guys were gone, and Charlie was all alone, they go 18-9 the next year. They go to the NIT. They lose to Manhattan in the first round. I think he's gone. And the idea that Dean Smith goes on to be this legacy Hall of Fame coach, beloved by his players, winningest coach in the history of basketball, how might that have changed the history of Carolina basketball?
Yeah, well, if you know anything about how black athletes like Lou Alcindor were treated when they announced that they were going to be boycotting, this fun and games international event, nothing quite as serious as NCAA basketball here in the state of Carolina, you get a sense of how people would have reacted. I'm really interested in one last theme here. For those of you who haven't read the book, again, it's really a history of race and politics in Chapel Hill. The campus, the town, how the town is desegregated. And the story you end with is the election of Howard Lee as mayor. Was it 1970? Is that right? Am I getting the year right?
1969, I think.
1969. Okay, 1969. The first African-American mayor of a predominantly white town. And you don't exactly say it in your book, although I sense that you wanted to. Were you contending by telling the story of Howard Lee at the end of this, that were it not for Charles Scott, Howard Lee never would have been elected mayor? Or rather, put another way, was Howard Lee elected Black mayor of Chapel Hill because of Charles Scott? Did Charles Scott have that effect?
Wow, good question. Good, really good question. I think it had some effect. There's no question about it. And I think that Dean was a champion. He was always a champion of the Black community. Charlie Scott was the personification of that. He got behind Howard Lee. He didn't really speak for Howard Lee, but he did vote for him. He told his friends. And the question was that how did Howard Lee he got elected? He got elected because the 400 to 500 members of the Black community in Chapel Hill came out to vote, where in the past they never had, because they never thought their vote made a difference. So Dean's message got into the Black community. Charlie helped him. A lot of other people helped him too. The Black community, believed in Howard Lee. They liked Lillian Lee. She was this beautiful young woman who was really not that happy about Howard running for office, but Howard was a guy who could make a difference, and they believed it, and they came out and voted, and Howard won a very close election based on the Black community. So, to this day, Howard Lee and Lillian Lee and the Smith family, until the day Dean Smith couldn't speak for himself anymore, were the closest of friends, and it's really it's a fabulous story about how the town of Chapel Hill turned the corner from being an old Southern town into one of these things. And people, writers from all over the country came to interview Howard because he was the first Black since Reconstruction in a white Southern town.
Yeah, and for those of you, again, who haven't read the book yet, well, first of all, read the book. And then if you don't know too much about the story of the desegregation of Chapel Hill, look, maybe Chapel Hill wasn't Birmingham, Alabama, but it wasn't that different. Some of the stories you tell about how the student protesters were treated in the Watts Grill and the Rock Pile in these places.
Oh, absolutely. Well, hold the back of that book up and show the picture on the back of the book. I mean, that is a march down Franklin Street, which you can't imagine today that would happen. That was a march down Franklin Street. And the idea that white students, Black students, by this time were joining it. Now, we as students, we didn't realize it because the UNC did its best to keep the protests off campus. Right. Even the speakers ban. They said, well, they were doing that to keep the communists off campus, but they were really doing it to keep the Black protesters off campus. And they were successful. And Roger, you remember this. It was on West Franklin Street, which is right now kind of today, it's the 1970s version of Chapel Hill. West Franklin Street with all the cool restaurants and everything. But West Franklin Street back then, nobody went to West Franklin Street as students. And that's where the protesters began, on Colonial Drugs and all those places down there. And we didn't really know that much about it because we were kept kept out of that part of town. But it's come a long way. It still has a lot of work to do, like racism everywhere in this country. But without Dean Smith and Bob Seymour and Howard Lee and people like that who really stood up for things, I think it had a big impact on how many of us went out to march against the Vietnam War just a couple of years later, and made our voices known with that protest as well.
Well, I know we're going to invite questions, and I think maybe people are supposed to put them in the chat if they have them, although I have a list of questions, and I'm going to get to one right now. I'm going to lean on your encyclopedic history, their knowledge of the UNC basketball program. In my race and basketball class, we talk about this issue about desegregation versus integration. And so, when a program has its first Black player, that program is then desegregated. And the question that we ask is, what does an integrated program look like? And I think there are different ways of defining what a truly racially integrated basketball program looks like. Is it when half the players are African American, when there's no attention paid whatsoever to the color of someone's skin, you're just going for the best basketball talent? And one of my students said, we were talking about the 1957 team. We're talking about the Dixie Classic. We were talking about college basketball in North Carolina, in Jim Crow, North Carolina in the 50s and 60s. And the student said, well, all right, I now know when the UNC program was desegregated, but when was it integrated? How would you answer that question? You mentioned Walter Davis and Phil Ford, and I'm wondering if you have a year in mind, or if you have a player in mind, or a time when you think that the UNC program was truly an integrated program.
Well, I mean, you can say that it was the year that Carolina started 5 blacks, but I don't think that was that big of a deal, because Carolina, up until that time, was recruiting, the Michael Corrins and the Mitch Kupchaks and the Steve Previses and really excellent white players. So I think it was mixed, and it was always, according to Dean Smith, 5 best players play. I want the best players and the best students. And that's kind of the way it was. And until, when you watch the NCAA tournament today, other than Iowa, funny, when we went to Iowa to play early this season, we started 5 blacks and they started 5 whites. I'm going like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
But basketball has become an African-American game now, and we can get into whole discussions all the way back to why Jimmy the Greek got fired by saying, that they were bred that way by the slave owners. But it's now, why are blacks more athletic, more successful in athletics than whites? I don't know, but that's become what the game is. And so now it's an integrated game. And as long as they win, and as long as they, everybody, the players, I think, are treated the same way. And I think schools that care really about academics, they have to toe the line. Schools that don't, players get in trouble left and right. But that doesn't, the racism in this country, because I think of the last presidential administration has been given a new breath of air to come out. I don't think racism will ever die, but I think it was shoved so far into the closet for a while that now that there's more of a license to come out and not only toward blacks, but what happened in Atlanta was awful, and the racism and the bigotry in this country is really back. So I don't know how to answer in terms of Carolina. I always felt like Phil Ford was the best point guard in the country. He came. There was a spot for him. When Dean went to his house, when everybody else was promising him everything, and Clemson was leaving a suitcase full of money on his dining room table, and Phil Ford's father called up Dean and said, Clemson just left, and they left a suitcase of money on, what should I do? And Coach Smith said, keep the money and send Phil to Carolina, So, in those days, he went in Phil Ford's house and talked education and racism to his parents. And he said, and Phil, I'm not sure you can start next year. You're going to have to come and prove it, while everybody else was promising him everything. So that's kind of the way the Dean Smith method went. And he challenged the athletes that he knew could win a job to come and win those jobs. And then, you've got Phil Ford, Walter Davis, all the way up to Michael Jordan, James Worthy, and those players that felt very comfortable coming to Carolina. And that is why I believe they became America's team in the mid 70s to late 70s.
Yeah. And I think the easiest answer to that question about, so many black players in college basketball and pro basketball is that, basketball has been an urban sport. Basketball is a game of opportunity. In my race and basketball class, we have this piece of sports writing from the 1930s, and it's explaining why Jewish Americans dominate basketball. And rather than just sort of looking at the fact that Jewish Americans were from the inner cities and basketball was an inner city game, this person comes up with all these theories about the racial temperament and the biological advantage of being short and close to the ground, which helps these are good with basketball. These theories that are out there to explain one group's domination.
Well, I can believe that they were tougher also, because they came from the background of people who had been
growing up in Hell's Kitchen too is going to make you tough, I think.
Right, exactly. So, but you can't deny. You can argue about it all day long, but you can't deny that African Americans are in general have more better athletes who run faster and jump higher and can do things that some white athletes can do, but most of them can't match them.
Yeah, you look right. So I'm wondering about one of the things that I was thinking about Charles Scott is, and again, I have Jackie Robinson on the brain, and having just talked about Jackie Robinson, we talked about the end of the Negro Leagues art. You know, Jackie Robinson goes to Major League Baseball, and then the Negro Leagues basically go away in just a couple of years. Maybe they exist for a decade, but they just cease to become relevant. And knowing the college basketball world like you do in North Carolina, was there any pressure on Charles Scott to go to one of the HBCs, to go to Central or go to Winston-Salem State, play for Clarence Big House Gaines or one of the great Black coaches in the state? And did the Black community in any way see this as a betrayal from Charles Scott to want to go to a, predominantly and historically white university?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that, but there was a guy named Henry Logan who went to Appalachian State, Western Carolina, actually, and he was sort of one of the guys who crossed the line. And then Earl the Goat Mendenhall did go to Johnson C. Smith in Charlotte and washed out after 1 year because he argued with the coaches all the time. So I think there was pressure, and Charlie watched the Loyola Chicago team in 1963 get to the Final Four and beat Duke, and so I think there was. But Lefty was a huge key in this, because when Charlie's father died his sophomore year at Laurinburg, he went back to New York for the funeral and then came back to Laurinburg. And Frank and Sammy McDuffie said, "Charlie, we're your family now. You don't have to go back to New York during the summer." And Lefty would always stop by Laurinburg at that time and say, "Hey, Frank, you got anybody who can get into Davidson?" And Frank said, "Well, we got a guy who's pretty good, and he's going to be valedictorian of his class here at Laurinburg. So I think you can probably get into Davidson." And that's where they had the relationship, to the point where Lefty got Charlie to make a commitment to Davidson after his junior year. And then the next year, early in the senior year, Laurinburg was going to Charlotte to play West Charlotte in a game in the old Charlotte Coliseum that got a lot of press. And they went down to the Charlotte for a press conference. And on the way back, McDuffie said, "Let's stop by Davidson and see Lefty." And that's the story where they walk into the Davidson basketball office, and the assistant coach, Terry Holland, is there saying, "Lefty's down at Cup of Joe," or whatever. I can't remember the name of the place, the Greasy Spoon right off the campus. And they all get on to see him, and Lefty says, come on in. And they go over, and Mrs. McDuffie likes what Lefty's eating. And he says, "Well, sit down and order something." And the waitress comes over and takes their order. And then 10 minutes later, the owner comes over and says, "Sorry, coach, we don't serve the N-word here. We don't serve them here. They're sitting behind the kitchen or wherever the other place was." And now Charlie wasn't offended by that, because he had been visiting Davidson and he knew there were places he could go and he couldn't go. And he was, he had a lifetime of racism. He had lived through it. But the McDuffies got really mad. And the backstory behind that, Matt, is that Frank McDuffie really wanted Charlie to go to the University of North Carolina, because he believed that was the biggest stage for him. And it was also a bigger stage for Laurinburg. And when that happened, he asked Charlie to open up his recruiting. And that's when Dean got involved, invited him down to Jubilee that weekend. Roger, remember Jubilee weekend? Yeah, and that weekend, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and the Temptations were playing. Dean brought him to Binkley Baptist Church, where they had the integrated congregation. And it all happened that weekend. And then the great salesman, Larry Brown and John Lotz, drove him back to Laurinburg. And they had asked Charlie in the car if he had liked it, would like to go to Carolina. And Charlie said, "Yeah, I do, but Mr. McDuffie said I have to visit 10 schools, and I've only visited 5 of them." So they show up at Laurinburg, they jump out of the car, and Larry and John Lotz go to McDuffie and say, "Hey, Charlie had a great time. I mean, he loved it. He loved his campus. He loved the players. He wants to play for Carolina, but you say he has to visit 5 more schools." And McDuffie said, "No, not really. If Charlie wants to go to Carolina, it's okay, And 2 days later, Dean's there with the scholarship, and they sign, and Lefty's recruiting in Texas, and he gets there too late, and And that's the whole thing. But Charlie loved Lefty all the way through. He told Lefty, I love you the best, but Chapel Hill is just a better place for me to go to school.
All right, there's some questions in here, and one of them, it was a statement, but I'm going to turn it into a question. It was from Angie. You were talking about marches in Chapel Hill, civil rights protests and anti-war protests, and she's pointing out a lot of the Black Lives Matter marches that happened in Chapel Hill over this summer and all across the United States, obviously. Mm-hmm. I sense that you're not reluctant to talk about politics. So
not at all. It's my second favorite subject.
So I was thinking over the last couple of years as college coaches were asked to comment explicitly on the issues of racism facing the United States and a lot of the episodes of police violence. I gotta be honest, I was a little disappointed in our current basketball coach. I thought he could have said more at certain times. And I'm wondering, with someone who knew Dean Smith and you know, just sort of lived under in Dean Smith's campus to a large degree, if that thought ever crossed your mind, if you ever thought, you know, my understanding of Dean Smith did not shy away from controversial political issues, always said what was on his mind, wasn't trying to do the politic thing necessarily. He was always trying to do what he thought was right. I was wondering if you ever had a moment in the last few years where you thought that this campus could have used Dean Smith's leadership.
Yeah, you know, Lene and I are friends, and during the interview where I got here to recount her going to the White House and the prelogue and the prologue and the prologue and the epilogue, she went in his stead because he was too sick at the time. It was the exact time where Carolina was going through the academic situation, and she was just really toasted about them. People calling this the worst academic scandal that's ever happened, you know, in the history of college athletics. And she said, if Dean was here, you know, he would have done something about it, because he would have talked to the right people and made sure that the right message got out. And she didn't think that Carolina handled that very well. But the idea that, you know, I don't think Dean always said was on his mind. You know, one of his favorite expressions was, I never lie, but I don't always say what I'm thinking. And so he picked his spots, but he surely would have picked a spot in these cases. I mean, he stood in Vietnam War vigils in Franklin Street. You know, he supported, he went to hear Martin Luther King speak in 1960. He supported it where he could, but he also knew that he was the basketball coach at UNC and representing it. I think, frankly, he did more after he retired, when he fought against the death penalty, and, you know, and he supported the Wilmington 7 and things like that. But you know, Roy stays in his lane, and he idolizes Dean Smith, but he always says, don't mention my name in the same sentence with Dean Smith, because we're not even in the same solar system as far as being a man. Roy did put out a video. He had the members of the championship team say something, but all the coaches were under pressure to do something. Yeah. You know, Krzyzewski put out that thing about say it, you know, say the words, that kind of thing. And I think that the one that Carolina put out, people called me and said, why wasn't Charlie in that? Why wasn't Charlie in that? I mean, if it's a message about Black Lives Matter, but it was only, if you look at that video, and it was not explained well enough, it was the video only by members of championship teams. And I thought that was a mistake. Because what difference does it make? You know, you want the players to make the statement who have the greatest impact. And to leave Charlie out of that was, you know, in retrospect, a mistake. And so that's why I think some people do have that opinion about why Carolina doesn't do more, and why they don't, certain people don't do more.
Well, along those lines, you know, I have my students read your book. I couldn't do it this year because of COVID, but I would then have them go to the Carolina Basketball Museum. And I'm guessing many of you have gone to the Carolina Basketball Museum before going to a basketball game. And it's a wonderful museum, and it's a wonderful experience. but I have them read your book, and then they go and they write a review of the museum. And I don't know if you all noticed this when you went to the kid, and I'm talking to everyone here. There is not a single picture of Charles Scott in the Carolina Basketball Museum. His name is mentioned. He's mentioned as an academic All-American, but there's not a photograph of him. And so a lot of my students we were starting to put a little pressure on the administration. Art, I'm pretty sure one of my students talked to you about this. And I'm hoping to kind of pick that back up again. Charles Scott has said that he sort of feels like his photograph ought to be on the wall somewhere. Again, not just for desegregating, but for his basketball accomplishments. And so for those of you who go to the Carolina Basketball Museum in the future, here's an opportunity to maybe say something on the way out. We talk about representation on our campus. We would talk about nothing but representation on our campus with that Civil War monument. Here's another way, I think, in which someone needs to be represented.
Yeah, I mean, you're right on, and they may have changed since then, because one of the things that they were very remiss at doing was recognizing Charlie Scott through the years. They finally started doing something when they made him a trailblazer. And they finally, with the 1968, 69, 67, 68, 9 team reunion in 2018, that was a big applause for him. But in my opinion, they haven't done nearly enough for Charlie Scott. Now, when you're a member of the Carolina First, which is a group of alumni who have done something for the first time, and they are supposed to get a scholarship named after them. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of very important people who've done things for the first time at Carolina, but tell me anybody who's done something first that even come close to what Charlie Scott did, and the courage that it took for him to do it, and the way he represented the university. And they still haven't named a scholarship after him. To me, who's in charge there? I've been dealing with the university for 100 years, and I'm very popular with some people. I'm not very popular with other people, because I've clashed with some people about things that I think were wrong. And everybody at university lives in a bubble, and the bubble existed long before the pandemic. And when you live in the bubble, you protect those people in the bubble. And you're very, very protective of them, especially from outside influences who try and criticize you. So the university, is way better than it was from what I recall and from what my research tells me, but it still has a long way to go in doing those things. Change is hard, because change is made by people in the bubble who listen to each other and very often tell each other how great they are, when they should be listening more to people from the outside.
Yeah. David, how are we doing? Do we need to end at a certain time, or did you want to? You want to weigh?
Yeah, we should go about 10 more minutes.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, if it's okay, Art, I'm looking at the questions here, and people are asking. So Charles Scott is the player who goes first for Black varsity basketball players. Is there a story about who goes second? Is that Chamberlain? I'm trying to.
It was Bill Chamberlain. Yeah.
Bill Chamberlain, and Chamberlain was as opposed to Scott, was very involved with the Black student movement. I mean, maybe because Charles Scott sort of laid the groundwork for him. Maybe,
but I'll think, Bill Chamberlain came from a completely different background. Bill he came from kind of the middle class neighborhood in Harlem, where his parents owned and managed real estate. And they sent him to a white high school Monday through Friday, where Charlie obviously was always in the Black community, the Black schools, the Black playgrounds and all that. And Bill came out of that experience as a high school player as somewhat of a radical and an outspoken radical. And I don't know, I think Bill wanted to be a pro basketball player too, but Charlie's consuming goal was to get a degree and to get into the NBA or get into the ABA at that time. And I think Bill Chamberlain asked Dean Smith if he could miss practice one day to go to the Black Student Movement March at the Lenore Hall cafeteria, and Dean let him do it and said, I usually don't, I'll do it for you this time. And the way out the door, he said, by the way, Bill, I agree with you. But so Dean was always telling his players that think about what you're doing, recognize what the situation is, and remember you're representing yourself, your personal family, and your Carolina basketball family. But say what you believe. It's always and we'll have you back. And he was hoping that they would do it in a way that it wouldn't force anybody into a corner to suspend them or throw them off the team or anything like that. But he always was warning and reminding his players what their responsibilities were as an athlete, as a student, and as to their family and their race, but always encouraging them to speak their mind. And Bill Chamberlain spoke it. I mean, he was the guy who almost said that if these 23 demands don't pass, we're quitting basketball. And so Bill was a freshman, right? When Charlie was a junior in the middle of the Black student movement. And after that 23 demand meeting with Citizen, the team got on a bus and went to Maryland for a game. Bill was back because he was a freshman. And so and Bill was talking after Charlie left to get on the bus and go to the airport. And Bill was still talking. So some writers called Charlie in the hotel in College Park and said, what about, you're going to quit basketball? And Charlie said, I never said that. And I was in that meeting. And I don't think Bill Chamberlain said that either. So he was covering for Bill as well.
Right.
But, it was an incredible time. And, I wish that I knew more about it and felt it more than I felt it. Researching and writing Game Changers was the best experience I've ever had. And I've written 10 books, but to research that and to the point where I felt it, because I never felt it back then. Roger, we didn't feel it. John, we didn't feel it, did we, when we were there? But when, if you could understand how those kids are in the middle of something, and thank goodness they had a guy like Dean Smith who could guide them through some of these things in a way that none of them really understood, the teammates that he was with at the time, because they're 18 and 19 years old. But in the reunion that they had in 2018, and they had a big dinner that night, where Roy got a copy of Game Changers for all of the players. He signed them, I signed them, and all that. But most of them had gotten the book beforehand because most of them had been interviewed for the book. But a lot of guys at the dinner that night stood up, some of them teary-eyed, and apologized to Charlie because they didn't realize they were part of the history they had made, and that they apologized because they were 18 and 19 years old and they had no idea what Charlie was going through. The one last story I'll tell you is that when Carolina signed Charlie Scott, Dean Smith drove down to Scotland Neck, North Carolina. There was a guy named Gray Whitehead who was on the team, and he was telling Gray, who lived on a kind of a plantation type of setting where he had all of these workers who were paid by that time by the family, but they were living in these shacks all over the place, and he kind of went down there not to ask Gray's permission, but to understand what was happening and say, "Now, Gray, I'll never. You don't have to room with Charlie on the road or in the dorm or anything, but I just want you to know we're bringing a black player in." And Gray was fine about it, But that Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving, the freshman year, Gray took Fogler, Delaney, Gersten, and a couple of other freshmen down to Scotland Neck to spend Thanksgiving with the team, and he didn't take Charlie. And Dean called Gray in on Monday morning after they get back, and he said, I heard you went down to Thanksgiving with some of the team members, but you didn't take Charlie. And Gray Whitehead, who didn't really last long in the program because he spoke his mind, said, "Coach, wait a minute here. You drove down to Scotland Neck to make sure that I was okay with us bringing a black player in the program, and now you're on my case because I didn't invite him down to my farm in Scotland Neck." And so those are the kind of positions that, the dean was put in, and he sometimes he felt he had to defend Charlie, and sometimes, he didn't. So.
Well, Art, we got time for one more question, and I'm going to ask you the question that for some reason I get asked all the time, knowing absolutely nothing about the inner workings of the UNC basketball program.
Right.
Whenever I give a talk that has anything to do with UNC basketball, someone always raises their hand and says, who is going to be the next coach of the UNC basketball program? I'm not trying to kick Roy Williams out the door. I'm not one of those people online who seem to be doing that these days, or it seems to happen every 3 or 4 years, and then he wins a national championship, and then those people go away. But I'm hoping I can plagiarize your answer, because I have nothing to say whenever people ask this. Who should be the next coach of the UNC basketball program?
Here's what I say. We're all some of us up there may remember, there was a series of movies back in the 70s called Airport. Dean Martin was in one of them. Remember, there was 3 or 4 of them and all that. It was always about the plane, whether there was mechanical problems, terrorism, weather, anything like that. It was always about the plane landing safe. The plane was the hero. My hero is the University of North Carolina, and beyond anybody who works there in any position. And when I've gotten on people, it's because I didn't think that the university chancellor, athletic director, or coaches were the best people for the job to protect my university. And I have a book that I don't want, maybe I'll write it someday, but nobody really wants to read it. It's because of what happened between 1997, when Dean Smith retired, and 2003, when Roy Williams finally came back. If you can think of the coaching hires and screw ups that we had during that time, because those weren't the best people to represent my university. So my answer to that question is whoever is the best coach available at the time when Roy does retire to represent us. And that's going to be a tough putt, because Bubba Cunningham is not a Carolina guy. I don't think he's married to the has to be somebody in the Carolina family. I don't think so. If everything is even and it is somebody, a Carolina guy, I'm sure that person will get the job, be it Wes Miller, who's an up and comer at UNC Greensboro, probably needs to have somebody on his staff that can make sure that they're in the ballpark for the 5-star recruits. Or if it's, somebody who, let's just say, Chris Holtman from Ohio State, maybe he wants to, move to one of the marquee schools. I think, I don't know who it's going to be, but I hope it's going to be somebody who is the best available person for the job. And it's not, the whole deal about Matt Doherty and what happened there. And I'll close by saying this: how grateful are we? How fortunate are we that Roy Williams said yes the second time in 2003? And how fortunate are we that Mac Brown comes out of retirement at age 68 to come back and coach football at Carolina? Where would those 2 programs be if those 2 coaches didn't come back?
Great answer. I like your airport analogy. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Whenever someone asks.
Land the plane. They say that in politics a lot. We're trying to land the plane here. We're trying to land the plane.
More of an airplane guy instead of an airport guy, but that's all right. Yeah.
Okay. I love airplane, my favorite,
All right. Thank you, Art. David.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and a special shout out to 1993 Tar Heel national champion Derek Phelps for joining us this evening.
Yeah.
Where is Derek? I don't see him up there.
Derek is here. So Derek, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And a big thank you to Art Chansky and Professor Matthew Andrews for a really engaging discussion. Have a fantastic evening, everyone.
Thanks, people. Pleasure to be with you.